All right, so tonight's speaker is Jonathan Horn. Now, he is a former White House presidential speechwriter and the author of The Man Who Would Not Be Washington, which was a Washington Post bestseller. His newest book and the subject of this lecture is Washington's End. Jonathan has appeared on CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, CBS, and PBS NewsHour, and has written for the Washington Post, the New York Times Disunion series, Politico magazine, National Review, The Daily Beast, New York Post, and many other outlets. A graduate of Yale University, he lives in Bethesda, Maryland with his wife, children, and dog. So now I am going to turn it over to you, Jonathan.
Well, thank you so much for that very, very kind introduction. And thank you to Fraunces Tavern for inviting me this evening to be with all of you to talk about the final forgotten years of George Washington's life. It's been a little bit more than 1 year since my new book, Washington's End, The Final Years in Forgotten Struggle, came out in hardcover. And I'm so pleased to be here with all of you this evening to celebrate its recent release in paperback. And that milestone got me thinking about how much the world has changed since this book first came out last year. Back then, going on book tour meant that you actually got to go places. And I'm particularly disappointed that I couldn't be with all of you tonight at Fraunces Tavern in person, because this is a place that is so associated with George Washington's memory. It's a place where he famously bade farewell to his fellow officers at the end of the Revolutionary War. It's a place where he staked his legacy to the idea of surrendering power. And it's a place where he laid the foundation for the story that we'll be discussing tonight, what he would do after he left the presidency. But since I can't be with you in person tonight, I want to do the next best thing, and that is to thank the men and women who preserve the historic treasure that is Fraunces Tavern. And I want to thank all of you joining us for supporting this institution's important educational mission. So thank you. The reason, of course, we can't be together this evening is the coronavirus. Now, our founding fathers would have had no idea what a virus was, but they did know something about pandemics. During the last years of George Washington's life, the period we'll be discussing tonight, the United States suffered a series of devastating yellow fever epidemics. During one such epidemic, in the year 1793, the then capital city of Philadelphia lost an estimated 10% of its population. And the reason I mention this history, depressing as it is this evening, is because I think in a strange way, it ought to give us hope. It's a reminder that our country has faced periods of great challenge before and overcome, and we can do so again, just as we're doing right now. So what drew me to the story of George Washington's last years? Well, that question requires going back to when I was on book tour for my first book, a Robert E. Lee biography titled The Man Who Would Not Be Washington. And everywhere I went, it seemed people made the same joke. Your next book should be about the man who was George Washington. And I had served as a White House speechwriter during the last years of an administration. And I had seen what happens, I should say what usually happens when a president leaves office. And that got me interested in the question of what happened to our first president when he left office. And to my surprise, the story of America's first post-presidency had never really been told in full. Now, that might strike you as really surprising. I know it struck me at first as really surprising. With all the biographies of George Washington, no one had ever told the full story of his post-presidency. Well, have a little bit of sympathy for George Washington's biographers. Just think about how much ground they have to cover. This is a man, after all, who heard the first shots of the French and Indian War fired, who held the Continental Army together during the long American Revolution, who presided over the Constitutional Convention, and who served 2 terms as president. Along the way, he married the rich widow, Martha Custis, helped raise her children and her grandchildren from her previous marriage, presided over the vast 8,000-acre estate known as Mount Vernon, forced men and women to work his lands as slaves, and pondered when and how he might one day set them free. and he became the most famous man in America. And by the time biographers get through all of that material, they tend to hit their page counts. Their deadlines for writing are up. Their editors are on the phone and saying, where is your book? Turn in your book. And I have some sympathy for that, by the way. And the result is that George Washington's last years tend to get shortchanged. So what gets left out? Well, George Washington left the presidency in March 1797, and he died in December 1799. That's a period of a little less than 3 years. I started writing this book in late 2015. So if you're doing the math at home, your calculations are right. That means it took me more years to write the story of George Washington's last years than it took him to live his last years. And now you're really wondering how that's possible. And that's a much harder question to answer. It's one that I've struggled with. And I know it's one that my very loving, very patient, and very supportive wife would also like to hear an answer to. And given that she's from the same city as Fraunces Tavern originally, I thought perhaps in her honor, I might take a shot at trying to answer that question tonight. What did take me so long in writing this book? What happened? Well, at first, the story seemed pretty straightforward. It needed to begin on March 4th, 1797. That was one of those days in history when people knew they were witnessing history. It was a day when if you had been in Philadelphia, you would have seen something that no one alive had ever seen before. Power peacefully transferring from one living head of state to another, from George Washington to John Adams. It was a day that George Washington had been looking forward to for years. He had actually wanted to retire from the presidency after his first term in office, but he had been convinced that if he did, the country would come apart. So he had reluctantly agreed to serve a second term. And by the time he finished that second term, there really was no argument in the world that could have convinced George Washington to serve a third term. Newspapers associated with an emerging opposition party had begun attacking George Washington's reputation. They had begun accusing him of behaving like a king and accused him of craving a crown. And he knew his legacy depended on doing essentially what he had done before in his life at Fraunces Tavern, bidding farewell to power, riding back to his Mount Vernon estate. And perhaps a little bit of physical description of George Washington at this point in his life might be useful. He was 65 years old. He had recently lost his last tooth. He was very self-conscious about the way his dentures pushed out his lips. His back was stooped. His hand had acquired a slight tremble. His hearing had weakened, but not so much that he could not hear whispers about his senility. His memory, which he felt had never been good, had gotten worse, and his vision had declined. Objects that looked clear in the distance blurred as they approached. George Washington did not believe he had much longer to live. No member of the Washington family lived a particularly long life, especially the males, and Washington saw no reason why he would be an exception. He imagined living out what few days he expected to have on this earth, riding around his farms at Mount Vernon, putting his mansion house back into order. He felt it had gone into disrepair during his presidency, and organizing his personal papers because he knew historians like yours truly were going to one day want to see those papers. And if all had gone according to plan, this would have been a pretty simple and straightforward book to write. But not all went according to plan. History was not yet done with George Washington at all. A little more than a year after leaving the presidency, George Washington found himself called out of retirement, put back in command of the armies of the United States, and drawn into very serious feuds with his immediate successor and his future successors. George Washington's peaceful retirement ended up being anything but peaceful. It was filled with intrigue, controversy, and personal torment. In short, surrendering power turned out to be far more difficult than George Washington ever imagined. Now, to be fair, there really wasn't a good precedent for what George Washington was trying to do. Americans at the time had heard of the famous story of the Roman general Cincinnatus, who had famously left his farm, assumed great power in Rome, saved the Republic, and then relinquished power and returned to his farm. But that story was thousands of years old. To understand how novel what George Washington was attempting to do in his own time was, you have to look across the ocean to Europe. Well, what was happening there? Well, the King of France had recently lost power, and very shortly afterwards, he had gone to the guillotine. And that's how things tended to work in the world at this point in time. When heads of state lost power, they tended to lose their heads. And in a different sense, you might say that George Washington lost his head as well. You know, we talk a lot about that word precedent when we talk about George Washington, and he deserves so much credit for the precedents that he put in place as president. And none was more important than his decision to leave office after 2 terms. But if we're honest, and I hope we can be tonight, I think we can admit that in some pretty important ways, George Washington's post-presidency diverges from how we think former presidents should behave today. Let me give you some examples. We today tend to believe that former presidents should largely avoid meddling in the affairs of their successors. But if you had asked John Adams, who was George Washington's successor, he would have told you that George Washington had majorly meddled in his presidency. Now, to be fair, some of that was John Adams' own fault, with French privateers seizing American ships at sea, and with the French government being unwilling to meet with American envoys on land. The United States began preparing for a war in 1798. And as part of the military buildup, it was John Adams who pulled George Washington out of retirement. It was John Adams who appointed George Washington commander-in-chief of the armies of the United States without apparently bothering to ponder why the Constitution specifically reserves that title, commander-in-chief, for the President of the United States, or unbelievably, even bothering to ask whether George Washington would have any conditions for acceptance. It turned out that Washington did have some conditions for acceptance. He did not want to take active command of this army unless there was an actual invasion by France, and he wanted to choose the second in command who would serve as the chief in his absence. And for that role, George Washington wanted someone who he had been specifically told John Adams did not want. The star of everyone's favorite musical, Alexander Hamilton. Now, perhaps a word is necessary about why John Adams really do not want Alexander Hamilton to be second in command of his army. Well, it didn't hurt that Adams knew that Hamilton had conspired against his election as president. But more important, both Adams and his wife Abigail believed that Hamilton more resembled a Caesar than a Cincinnatus, and privately believed he could not be trusted with this kind of military power. But publicly, John Adams could not afford a falling out with George Washington, who made it clear that he would resign if he did not get his way. So ultimately, after some pretty tense back and forth between the former president and the sitting president, John Adams had to give way, and George Washington got his man. And as Adams later told the story, he felt that he really had no other choice, because if he hadn't appointed Hamilton second in command of this army, Hamilton would have gotten the command through some other route. Adams believed that Washington would have simply stood for the presidency in the next presidential election, obviously won, and then appointed Hamilton commander of the armies. Now, crazy as that sounds to us today, and it does sound crazy, there's actually some evidence to suggest that John Adams was right to worry. As Adams pursued a new opportunity for peace with France, a new opportunity for negotiations that ended up ensuring this war never became a full-scale war, very influential people in communication with members of John Adams' own cabinet began pursuing a plot to replace Adams as president, and to replace him by convincing George Washington to stand for president in the election of 1800. And much as George Washington tried to silence all talk of this idea, it persisted. And that brings me to another pretty important way in which I think George Washington's post-presidency diverges from the way we think former presidents should behave today. We today tend to think that former presidents become less partisan when they leave office. We tend to think that somehow leaving office lifts former presidents above petty political feuds. But if we're honest, we can say that just the opposite happened to George Washington. He descended deeper into partisan politics than ever before. And I think the reason that sounds so surprising is when we think about George Washington's last years, we tend to think about his famous farewell address, which urged Americans to avoid the spirit of political parties. But less remembered is a letter that George Washington wrote during the final months of his life, when he said matters had reached such a state that all people only had a choice between one party or the other. And no American could escape this choice. And the choice back then was between either being a Federalist or a Republican. And by this time, George Washington was very much a Federalist. He involved himself in congressional electioneering in a way that he never would have as president. He favored excluding all Republicans from command of this new army. This was going to be very much a Federalist partisan force. He even supported the infamous Alien and Sedition Acts, which actually led to journalists associated with the Republican Party being imprisoned. And to give you a sense of how far things eventually went, George Washington was no longer on speaking terms with three of the most prominent Republicans. Perhaps you've heard their names before: Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and James Monroe. Oh, wait, that's your third, fourth, and fifth presidents of the United States. Just hearing a report of a speech that James Madison had given in favor of electing James Monroe governor of Virginia sent George Washington into an absolute rage on the evening of December 13th, 1799. It turned out to be the very last news report that George Washington ever received, because he died in truly agonizing fashion the next night, when essentially his throat, his windpipe sealed shut, and he essentially choked to death in a very painful, agonizing fashion. And perhaps it was for the best that he did not live to see the election year of 1800, because he would not have been happy at all with the result, Thomas Jefferson winning the presidency. This was really a period where so many relationships between our founding fathers came apart. And it was not just politics that ended these relationships. This was a period where more than politics were tested. It was also personal relationships were cut. And I'm sorry to say that even some relationships that have been immortalized and sealed at Fraunces Tavern were deeply wounded during this period. You know, we all know the story of George Washington, I think, bidding farewell to his officers at Fraunces Tavern at the end of the American Revolution. And there's probably no more famous scene than George Washington embracing Henry Knox, who had been his artillery chief during the Revolution. Embracing him, George Washington was so emotional that he could not even muster a word in that moment. It's a touching scene, and it's the way we want to remember the Washington-Knox relationship. But it's not actually the way the Washington-Knox relationship ended. It actually ended in 1798, when Henry Knox discovered that George Washington had decided to rank Alexander Hamilton above Henry Knox in the new army being formed to fight France. And this was a tremendous insult to Henry Knox, because Henry Knox had been a major general during the Revolutionary War, and Alexander Hamilton had been a mere colonel. And to give you a sense of what happened, when Knox heard the news, he wrote George Washington that basically he had prided himself for 20 years on the idea that George Washington held him in high esteem. And now he realized that he had been living his life under a perfect delusion. And Washington and Knox traded some pretty bitter letters over what had happened, and then they would never, ever write each other ever again. So much for all of our founding fathers getting along. Perhaps the one thing all of our founding fathers seemed to agree on at this point in time was that they might be living in the last days of the American Republic. There was a sense that the country was really coming apart, and people had previously believed that George Washington could always hold the country together. But Washington would have been the first person to tell you by this time he no longer could hold the country together. And when you look back at what people were worried about back then, their fears, I think, sound very familiar to us today. They were worried about foreign intervention in American elections. We think 2016 was the first time a foreign power ever intervened in an American election. But actually, the very first foreign intervention in an American election was the very first competitive presidential election in American history in 1796. A foreign power, France, had intervened unsuccessfully on behalf of the Republican Party. They were worried back then about new forms of media. Back then, it was the explosion in the number of partisan newspapers, spreading what we today might call fake news. And they, like us today, were worried about the increasing politicization of their entire society, the idea that politics was infecting everything they did. And to give you a sense of how far this went again, I mentioned that our founding fathers did not know what caused yellow fever because they did not know what a virus was. And because science couldn't answer this question, doctors tended to turn to politics to answer it. And research has shown that doctors associated with the Republican Party tended to blame local environmental factors for the yellow fever epidemic, and doctors associated with the Federalist Party tended to blame foreigners and immigration. No wonder people thought the country was coming apart. But of course, the country did not come apart. It endured. And that was the problem that I struggled with as a biographer. How do you write the history of things that do not end up happening? How do you explain how people who many of us admire held fears and made decisions that sound illogical or even absurd when viewed through the lens of hindsight? Well, one approach is just to tell the story through the comforts of the 21st century and have a laugh about everything that people in the past got wrong. But the problem with that approach is that it robs the past of the suspense and uncertainty with which people actually experienced it. It gives us the smug self-confidence to think we might have made better decisions had we been alive back then. And I think nothing could be further from the truth. I don't think you can judge a decision that someone in the past made unless you understand what information they were working with. So I made a decision in writing this book, and that decision was I would only present the reader with information that was then known to people I was writing about. And I would only introduce new information as it became known to my characters. And the effect, I hope, is to let readers experience the past through the eyes of those who lived it. Now, that raised its own question that I struggled with as a writer. From whose eyes should you tell the story? The temptation was just to say George Washington's eyes. But remember what I said. George Washington's eyes were no longer as good as they once were. Objects that looked clear in the distance blurred as they approached. The story of an aging patriarch struggling to cede control needed to make room for other perspectives, those of his political friends, his political enemies, and other members of the Mount Vernon community. No longer could George Washington dominate events the way he once had. No longer could he alone even speak for the name Washington. The name was no longer just his. It belonged to a rising capital city that would open the year after George Washington died. It didn't look like much back then, just some wide avenues cut through the trees, a boxy grayish white house at one end of the major thoroughfare, one wing of the Capitol at the other end. But George Washington had high hopes for this place. It was he who had chosen its spot on the Potomac River. It was he who had overseen its construction late into the night as president. And it was he who had given his name to the place, Washington. He hoped the city could do what he manifestly no longer could, and that was hold together the feuding and factions tearing the country apart. And that was the ultimate realization that I had as a biographer. The story I needed to tell was not just Washington's end, it was the beginning of Washington, the city I call home. It wasn't just a book about the last years of a great man's life. It's about everything that has happened in America since. as George Washington looked back on the course of his post-presidency during the final months of his life, and no one was more surprised by what course the post-presidency had taken than George Washington himself, he said, "We know little of ourselves and much less the designs of Providence." Well, I think that must be true for biographers as well, because I could not have imagined how long it would take me to write this book when I started, and I could not have imagined where it would lead me. But I'm very happy to find myself here with all of you this evening in Fraunces Tavern, and I would be honored to answer your questions. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you so much, Jonathan. Now I'm going to turn it over to my coworker, Ali Delianis, who is going to ask your questions and start curating those from the Q&A. So if you have a question you haven't submitted yet, please submit it now.
Great, thank you so much, Jonathan. The first question I have is, when you were doing research for this book, what was the most interesting thing that you discovered?
I think the most interesting thing I discovered was just how difficult it was for George Washington to surrender power, and what a struggle it was, and how many forces were constantly trying to pull George Washington back into the political fray. Now, I think you might ask yourself, did this somehow lower my opinion of George Washington? Did I think less of George Washington as a result of seeing what a struggle it was? No, actually just the opposite. And I should say I went into this with a pretty high opinion of George Washington, and I left with an even higher opinion, because only by understanding how difficult it was to surrender power, only by understanding how many forces were trying to lure our first president back into the political fray, can you appreciate the strength of character that George Washington needed to have to do what he did. And I think you can only then appreciate his true greatness.
That actually brings me to my next question. So what did Washington expect surrendering power to look like? Do we know?
Well, that's a great question. I think, as he laid it out, he really did imagine himself riding back to Mount Vernon. He said he wasn't going to ever stray more than 15 or 20 miles from Mount Vernon ever again. And he imagined himself riding around his farms at Mount Vernon. And I should say, by the way, Mount Vernon is not just a little farm. And sometimes we think of it as a little farm. It is a vast, sprawling estate. Almost, you have to think of it almost as a business. So it has 5 farms. And he imagined himself riding around. He wanted to rent out many of the farms, actually. And he sort of imagined himself, by renting the farms, being able to live off what he called a fixed income. But he never ended up finding people he felt were truly properly qualified to take care of the Mount Vernon farms. And this is actually kind of an interesting anecdote to share. He felt that Virginians made really bad farmers. And so who did George Washington want to manage his farms in retirement? English farmers. He thought the best farmers were from England. So here is the man who chased the British out of America, hoping the British will come back and run his farms for him in retirement. But he's never able to actually surrender enough, sort of give up control. He really is a micromanager of his farms. And the person he ultimately brings in to help serve as the overall manager, he never rents the farms themselves, is constantly threatening to quit because he says George Washington is micromanaging him. And the reason I mention this is because I think it gives you an idea that this was a man for whom surrendering power did not come naturally. He liked having control, and you can see that in the way he ran Mount Vernon. And so what else was he planning to do? Well, he really did want to put his personal papers in order. That was a very important thing to him. And he was talking about setting up an archive, essentially, at Mount Vernon. He knew people were going to one day want to see those papers. He never really got to build that archive. Thankfully, the people at Mount Vernon have actually put together a presidential library. Essentially, that was George Washington's idea. They put together a wonderful facility that really is finally, just recently it opened, and it sort of finally lives up to what George Washington deserves. And he was very interested in his personal papers and preserving them for posterity. And in fact, he spent some time editing his personal papers. And you might wonder, what was he doing to his personal papers during this period? What kinds of changes? Was he trying to change his place in history? Was he trying to make himself look better? No, surprisingly enough, the answer is that almost all of his edits were grammatical. he was worried that the grammar and spelling he used as a younger man would embarrass him. So we can see he went back and changed some of the wording he used, but he really didn't change the content at all. He was just insecure about the way he wrote as a younger person. And by the way, and I can tell I'm almost rambling now in this answer. I hope I'm not losing anyone. But sometimes people say, you'll hear things that George Washington wasn't actually a good writer and he couldn't have written anything himself, and only because he had Alexander Hamilton was he ever able to write anything that was worthwhile. And there were actually people during George Washington's own life who believed this, including someone named Timothy Pickering, who was a cabinet secretary under George Washington, later on would spread lies about George Washington, say he couldn't write anything, he could barely spell. And it's a total lie. George Washington was a very effective writer. And I think if you go back and read his letters, you'd be truly impressed with the way he was able to write. And I think if he lived today, he would be a very, very effective emailer. So watch out if you ever get an email from George Washington.
That's a good segue into the next question I have here. Jim and Susan ask, didn't his wife burn many of his papers? That must have made your job a little bit harder.
Yes. Martha Washington, we do believe, burned her correspondence, and his correspondence, their marital correspondence, essentially, before she died. And before you say, why did Martha Washington do this? Probably she had some instruction from George Washington to do it. I don't think it's fair just to blame her for whatever happened. And of course, it's a major loss to history. We only have a few letters left between George and Martha Washington as a result. Now, as to what we've lost, we have some idea because George Washington described at one point during his last years what someone would see if they ever found his letters to Martha. In fact, he had left a bundle of the letters in Philadelphia when he left the city, and a woman wrote him and said, I'm in possession of your letters to a woman. And he said, well, if you read those letters, first of all, they're to my wife, you would realize that they're more filled with sentiments of friendship than the ardor of romance. And I think that's probably the best way to understand the George and Martha relationship. It was more based on friendship. And I think he believed that friendship actually was the best foundation for marriage. Rarely were they alone during their marital life. There were always guests at Mount Vernon, but always did they like to be near each other. And I think, again, there's the way George Washington described that correspondence is probably the best window into understanding George Washington's relationship with Martha.
It's very interesting. This is a Martha Washington question, so this is a good transition. Kathy says, Martha Washington was known to say that second to her husband's death, the worst day of her life was when she had to host Thomas Jefferson at Mount Vernon. Is there any other insight on what Martha thought about her husband's post-presidential years and after his death?
Well, I'm really happy you mentioned that story because, first of all, Thomas Jefferson basically doesn't put out any sort of public statement when George Washington died. And it would have been, he does make some private comments about it. Sometimes instead he said nothing. That's not completely true. He did say some things. But he doesn't pay any visit to Martha Washington. He doesn't send a condolence letter. He basically waits until during the election of 1800 is a complicated election because it's ultimately going to be settled in the House of Representatives. And for a time, it seems that Thomas Jefferson might need some Federalist support. And Thomas Jefferson, as I mentioned, is a Republican. And the Federalists, of course, are the party of George Washington. And Thomas Jefferson and George Washington were not on good terms and was well known by this point. And we can talk more about that later if one of you asks a question about the George Washington-Thomas Jefferson relationship. But suffice it to say, it was well known they were not on good terms. So Thomas Jefferson waits until he's going to need some Federalist support to decide, oh, you know what, now I'm going to go pay my respects to Martha Washington. So right before that important vote in the House, he rides off to Mount Vernon. He goes to see Martha Washington, and she basically records it as that he cried crocodile tears by Washington's tomb. And in fact, she does say, second to George Washington's death, it was the most painful moment of her life. And so I think it gives you a sense that Martha was more political than perhaps we might think. And in fact, we have some sense of of the continuing politics of Mount Vernon after George Washington died. And there's some reason there really was a strong Federalist streak that continued at Mount Vernon, which is also, of course, insight into what George Washington himself believed.
Very interesting. All right. My next question here is from somebody, the username Nexus7. I assume they're on their phone. Are there any illustrations that might shed light into Washington's final years? We often see him portrayed as the president or the commander-in-chief.
That's a great question. It's one that I struggled with when because a lot of people don't realize when you write a book, you think your job is done when you wrote all the words, you get through all the edits, but there's another thing that authors have to do. They have to get photo permissions and illustration permissions for their books, and people don't realize that authors have to do that themselves, but they do. I didn't know that until I wrote my first book. Maybe you all knew that. And so it turns out there's really no great portrait of Washington from this period. We have some really great portraits of Washington just as he's about to leave the presidency. And those portraits are sort of your best insight into what Washington might have looked like. And you can see his face, and there's some pretty good portraits from that period, just around the 1796 period. As for illustrations during his post-presidential life, you really do have to rely somewhat on historical memory. These recreation scenes. There's a famous painting of George Washington's deathbed. It's a dramatic painting. It's not based on the actual scene, of course, and there's some characters there who could not have been there in real life, and people aren't in proper position necessarily, but it's still a very compelling painting, and I included it in my book, even though it's not exactly accurate, because it gives you a sense of how people remembered George Washington's death and thought about George Washington's death afterwards. And that in its own way is a form of history as well. How did people remember events that happened?
Very interesting. I know that painting. I believe we use it on social media every year as our On This Day post. That's the quintessential image, I'm sure. Okay, my next question comes from Margot, and she wants to know if you think that George Washington was happy and content when he died.
He was absolutely, I mentioned he received a news report that James Madison had had given a speech endorsing James Monroe for governor of Virginia on December 13th, 1799. And we have an account from his personal secretary that basically it sent George Washington into an absolute rage. And I think it's fair to say there was no one who George Washington liked less in public life than James Monroe. And basically James Monroe had served as George Washington's minister to France. And it turned out to be a pretty bad appointment for George Washington. James Monroe was an ardent Republican, and essentially had to be recalled from France because he was not accurately representing the priorities of the George Washington administration. So what does Monroe do? Well, like every other disgruntled member of an administration, he comes home and writes a tell-all book. And we know George Washington hated this tell-all book because we have his annotations of the tell-all book, and we can see him angrily scribbling in the margins of the tell-all book. And at one point he scribbles, if James Monroe ever becomes president of the United States, let's see what he can do. And he almost writes it as a joke because he can't imagine that James Monroe would ever become president of the United States. So it's probably good, again, that he did not live to see that. So was George Washington feeling particularly good about the country at that point? I'm sorry to say no. He really did think the country was on a bad course. He talked about it as a ship that was on a dangerous course. He really was worried about what was going to happen if the Republican Party took over control of this country, as did happen after his death. But he basically said, he's brought back into these affairs in a way he never imagined. And in his final months, his final weeks of life, he basically says, well, it's going to be for others to have to steer the course and to have to get through these challenges. But unfortunately, when we look back, we can't say he died with complete confidence in what was going to happen. He did not have a particularly good feeling about what was going to happen to this country. And that's sad, but at the same time, he sort of had an attitude that, And you know, that's, again, I think when you think about that, you have to remember that this country was his legacy and how attached he was. And that again gives you an idea of how difficult it would have been for George Washington to surrender power with these dangers that he saw coming, approaching the country. But he basically said, I'm gonna have to hope for the best like everybody else.
That's a good segue into our next question. This comes from Ryan. You mentioned that Thomas Jefferson didn't make any public pronouncement after George's death, but what was the general Republican reaction? Was the party's, festivities put aside? Was there time to mourn, or were they gloating? What was kind of going on there?
Well, there was a feeling, at least when you look at Thomas Jefferson's correspondence, basically, that the Federalists would keep using George Washington as a shield to advance their cause for as long as he lived. And he basically said Republicans were going to have to wait on their oars, was a phrase he used, until George Washington was gone. And then they could restore the United States to its proper course. He essentially felt that George Washington was being abused, being used, manipulated by people like Alexander Hamilton. Essentially, he didn't say it in his words, but essentially he was suggesting he was almost senile at this point and not fully in control of himself. And some whispers of some of this had gotten back to George Washington himself. So what was the response? Well, I think it's fair to say that the Federalists saw this as an outstanding political opportunity. I mean, while the country mourned deeply for George Washington. It was a real sense of national mourning, and it went on and on and on and on the mourning. And to give you a sense, George Washington said, for example, there would be no military parade at his funeral, which was going to happen in Mount Vernon. But there was, in fact, a military procession at his funeral, despite his orders. And then there was then, of course, you have the mock funeral in Philadelphia, and you have the famous address by Light Horse Harry Lee, saying first in war, first in peace, and first in the hearts of his countrymen. And then there's talk about how do we remember George Washington? How do we honor George Washington? And there's talk about where he should be buried, about what kind of monuments to be built for him. And there's a sense that using his memory almost as a way to keep the Federalists in power, I think it's fair to say. One thing I like, and again, I hope I'm not rambling too much here, is that the person who was the architect of the Capitol, and I mentioned that the Capitol at this point is really just one wing, has the idea that George Washington's body should go under the rotunda. And there is no rotunda at this point. There's no dome of the Capitol. There's only one little wing. But he wants to move his body there. And he says, because it will force people to finish the Capitol. And that was a concern back then. Will people actually follow through on the plan? He sees this as an opportunity to use George Washington's body to advance his own cause. So again, Washington's legacy is going to be something that's fought over for years. And you can even see this continuing on into the Civil War, to be honest with you, where both sides of the Civil War will try to claim George Washington's legacy for their own. You'll have Virginia, you have Confederates who will say George Washington fought against the Union with the British, and he was a slaveholder like us. And you'll have Unionists who say, no, read George Washington's farewell address. It says, prize the Union above any local allegiance. So again, George Washington's memory continues to have tremendous political power long after he is dead.
That's interesting. That's makes a good connection to the next question I have. Sheila asks, you mentioned that Washington thought about how he could release his slaves. Did he ever get around to doing that?
So that's a wonderful question. I'm glad you asked that question. So as George Washington is preparing to leave the presidency, he is actually working out a secret plan to end slavery at Mount Vernon. And part of that plan is renting the farms. And essentially, he thinks he can use some of the income to sort of break his dependence on enslaved labor. And then he hopes that the tenants might hire the former slaves to work on their land. And there are a couple other moving parts of the plan, but essentially the plan is unworkable. And it's unworkable for a variety of reasons, but the most important impediment is that the majority of Mount Vernon's slaves were not George Washington's to free. The majority of Mount Vernon's slaves belonged to the estate of Martha Washington's first husband. And that's an important thing to get right because they weren't even in Martha Washington's power to free. They belonged to her, the estate of her first husband. And so when she died, their future belonged to her 4 grandchildren. And George Washington was sensitive to this because he realized as he looked at his slaves that many of his slaves had intermarried with slaves belonging to the so-called dower slaves belonging to that estate. And he realized if he set his slaves free, that it would create what he called painful consequences. And he used that word painful because it was going to split up marriages. And it actually, when you look at George Washington's will, and he puts this he describes this in detail in the will because he wants us to know that it was not in his power to emancipate all of Mount Vernon slaves because he knew his will was going to be read by generations and generations afterwards. So he wants this to be known, and he knows that painful consequences are going to result. And so essentially he provides eventual freedom for the slaves belonging to him, and he says he cannot free the other slaves. Now, I mentioned it was not in Martha Washington's power to free those slaves either, and it's not, by the way, clear that she would have wanted to free them, even if she could have. She did own 1 slave outright who she could have freed when she died, and she chose not to. She left him to her grandson. So anyway, the result of all this is that Mount Vernon will pass into history the same way as the country that George Washington founded, half slave and half free. Now, of course, there is one other way that George Washington could have gotten around this problem, both at Mount Vernon and perhaps for the country, and that is to have fought for emancipation of slaves broadly, for abolition. And we do know that George Washington privately supported, he hoped that Virginia, he said no one wanted it more than he did, for Virginia to pass a law ending slavery. And he believed it would eventually happen because he said Virginia so closely resembled a state like Pennsylvania that Virginia's future would be more profitable if it simply followed the Pennsylvania course and ended slavery. Now, you might ask, well, did he do a lot publicly to work for this? No, I can't say he did, unfortunately. Now, would it have made a difference if he had? Probably not. Now, why wouldn't it have made a difference? Because, to be honest, George Washington didn't have the political power to pull this off. By his last years, he was very estranged from his home state of Virginia. Power had really begun shifting away from George Washington's Mount Vernon to Thomas Jefferson's Monticello. That was where the power in Virginia was headed. And George Washington, I think even if he had spoken out more loudly about his belief, it wouldn't have made a big difference.
Interesting. That's a good point. This next question is actually my own. So why did Washington choose Hamilton as a second in command instead of Knox?
Well, that's a fascinating question. I'm glad you asked that. So ultimately, first of all, that wasn't his first instinct. He initially wanted to have a Southerner, which wouldn't have been Knox, as second in command. So he was thinking about Charles Cotesworth Pinckney to be second in command at first. But he's getting letters from other people saying things like, Hamilton is the best person for this, and Hamilton will only serve as second in command. And we think it's important that you give Hamilton the position. And in a sense, those letters combined with George Washington's own personal preferences end up swaying him. And he knows it's going to be a problem because, just to put it out there, no one is more sensitive to issues of rank than George Washington was. And if you look back at his correspondence during the French and Indian War, you can see it. This is a man who understands that army officers take rank as a very serious matter. So he understands there could be a problem, but he also believes that Alexander Hamilton, despite having merely been a colonel during the American Revolution, by having served as George Washington's most important aide, had had the opportunity to see the war through a lens that very few others had. He had been able to see the perspective of the commander-in-chief by writing his letters, by inhabiting his spirit, in a sense, which is what George Washington believed a good aide needed to be able to do. So he believed that, in a sense, Alexander Hamilton had been able to take this global view of the conflict the same way as George Washington, and it would serve as good preparation for being able to step into the role of commander-in-chief if necessary. So he ultimately insists that Alexander Hamilton is the right way to go, even though, as I said, Adams will really try to fight back against this. And you really do have a very tense back and forth between George Washington and John Adams. And Adams is saying, this is my call. I'm the president of the United States. The Constitution gives me the right to make these decisions. And Washington's saying, I put as a condition for acceptance that I would not take this command unless I got to choose my general officers. Now you might say, why did George Washington feel so strongly about this? Well, he was really worried about his legacy. He was worried about, he thought a lot about what would people say about him coming out of retirement to take this command? Would they say he was too old? Well, France had been having fabulous success with younger generals. You've heard of one of their names, Napoleon Bonaparte. He was worried that people would say that his retirement had been a sham and that he couldn't really be happy in retirement at all. And that's why he was coming out of retirement just barely a year after leaving power. And he was worried, I think, most of all about failure. He was worried about doing something that wouldn't work, that he would tarnish his legacy. And that's why he really cared about who his second in command was. He wanted someone who he could trust. And ultimately, through a strange process, it brought him to Alexander Hamilton.
Interesting. This next question kind of goes off of that. It's from Frank. He asks, did Washington leave any comments about the fact that during his later years, the relationships with many of the younger military officers like Knox, Burr, and Hamilton kind of broke down?
Well, so you know, in terms of Knox, first of all, it's a different situation, I think, than someone like Burr. Washington always believed that Burr was something of an intriguer. And there was some thought, actually, interesting enough, Hamilton, of all people, was open to having Burr serve in this army, which is interesting to consider given later history. But Washington really was not open to having any Republican in the army. He wanted only Federalists in the army. This was going to be a politically pure force. And he believed that essentially, to understand why, because, of course, we don't have political tests for who serves in the army now. We wouldn't want that. But why did he want that? Well, he essentially worried that Republicans might serve as agents for France and undermine the cause of their own country. He didn't trust them. And that's why it was so important to him to have people he could trust.
Interesting. Okay, this is going to be my last question. It's quite important. If you could dine with anybody at Fraunces Tavern, dead or alive, who would you choose?
Well, I mean, that's a great question, but I think no one's going to be surprised that I'm going to say George Washington. And I don't need him to be eating with me necessarily. I could just be at the next table somewhere and just eavesdropping on the conversation. My hunch is I might not learn a lot, though, because especially if you meet George Washington later in life, he was very careful about what he said. He knew that if you had dinner with George Washington, and by the way, tons of people came to Mount Vernon to have dinner with George Washington during these last years. Everyone wanted to gawk at the great George Washington. He knew you were going to do two things. Number one, you were going to go home and write in your diary about how you had dinner with George Washington. And you were going to go send a letter to your friends, maybe even your local newspaper, about how you had dinner with George Washington. And here's what he said. So he had to be pretty careful about what he said. And so he opened his mouth very carefully. He was very, very careful of what he said.
Interesting.
All right, well, that is about our time for the evening. Thank you so much, Jonathan, for that great presentation and your answers. I feel like I learned a lot about someone we hear about a lot at Fraunces Tavern, and there's still so much that isn't common knowledge. And thank you, Allie, for that Q&A, and thank you to all of you for submitting your questions and joining us. Our next lecture is not till the end of June. Tickets are already up online, though. If you're looking for something museum related and you're in the New York City area, on June 5th and 6th, it's a Saturday and Sunday, we are holding a George Washington and Hamilton in New York City walking tour. Tickets are available for that now. If you want to stay up to date with all of our programs, you can join our mailing list and visit our website at FrauncestavernMuseum.org. Follow us on social media. If you want to check out the book, it is Washington's End, The Final Years and Forgotten Struggle, available in hardcover, paperback, audiobook, and ebook, wherever books are sold. And yes, Allie has just dropped our events calendar into the chat. If you'd like to check that out, we'll be listing soon some more of our summer events, but this goes through the end of June. If you have enjoyed our programs, We encourage you, if you are able, to make a donation to help support the museum and keep our programs running. Thanks to the many, many of you who have already donated. Every little bit is appreciated and helps keep us able to keep doing these programs virtually if we can't be doing them in person. So with that, I think we are all done for the evening. Enjoy the rest of your evening, afternoon, depending on where you are. And we hope to see you again at our next virtual program.
Thank you.